you everyone for joining us today, Touton Live. This is our bi-weekly conversation with our top winemakers, distillers, and owners. So today we're very fortunate to have Mike Griffo joining us today of Griffo Distillery in the Petaluma Valley of Sonoma County. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before I turn it over to you, and you guys have a really cool background and story, I just want to show everyone. I like to start out just by showing everyone on a map. I like maps, showing us where we're at today. So we're in the north coast of California, about 50 minutes to an hour north of San Francisco, in the Sonoma County. So this is a zoom in of Sonoma on our map. And in the southwest of Sonoma, you have the Sonoma coast and then the Petaluma Gap, which is where the distillery is located. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few. So just tell us a bit about your history, how you got started, and how you wound up in Petaluma, of all places.
Yeah, absolutely. My background is actually in the sciences. I have a doctorate in physics. Back in the day, whatever this was, 2008, 2007, something like that, my wife and I, who we weren't married yet at the time, I was finishing up my doctorate, and we were at a friend's winery on the Sonoma coastline during one of their sort of debaucherous 3-day-long 4th of July parties.
Sounds dangerous.
Yeah, very dangerous. But also, it just doesn't get any better, right? Like, you're on the vineyard and you've got a pig that's in the ground and you're eating oysters and drinking champagne and listening to live music. And caught up in the moment, I said, we should open up a winery because I could do this every day. Because, Of course, that's what winemakers do every day. And my wife, who'd lived on a vineyard in St. Helena, Napa, said, she doesn't fully get my dry wit all the time. And she said, no, you don't want to do that. It's a lot of vineyard management, and you're fighting the frost, and you're fighting all these elements of nature, and the grapes are so fragile. And she was actually the one that suggested that we open up a distillery, because I was already distilling all the time in the laboratory.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, I guess long story short is that you should be careful what you suggest to me, because here we are 13 years later. We took a few years after that conversation where, me being the researcher that I am, I just started diving into books, and I started playing around and talking to people, because I really latched onto the idea. I've always been, a spirits guy. I was the guy in college that was drinking scotch and Bombay Sapphire gin and drinking nice wines and eating good cheeses and all that sort of stuff, just a foodie. And so I really love the idea of creating a good spirit, especially with my science background, because, while there's so much romance that takes place within the art of the distilling, you also need really good controls to understand what you're doing and what impact you're having while you're doing a distillation. And so, and that's true for wine as well, where winemakers are measuring their bricks and they're checking for the ripeness of the grapes and harvesting and controlling fermentations and all that too. And there's so much science behind the romance of what we do. It's really critical to have a good understanding of what's going on.
No, I was going to say, people don't realize that wineries all have a lab, and it's true in your world as well. It's all very scientific and very precise. Well, if you're going to do it well, at least. But so I want to get into some of the precision and what you've been doing differently than I don't think I've ever heard anybody using such precise measures. So tell me a bit about your custom still and what you're doing and the measures that you're taking, because I think it's very fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Our still was made in Louisville, Kentucky, out of Vendome Copper and Brass, which is a 4th generation family owned copper and brass works. They make the stills for all the big boys. Jack Daniels and everybody out there in Kentucky and Tennessee. And then they also make the smaller stills for guys like us. And they are the most reputable manufacturer in the U.S. There's another good still manufacturer in Bavaria. They do a good job on their stills. But when I came through there, I had all my own ideas on what I wanted out of my still. And I sat down with their engineers, and they sort of, coached me on what was probably a terrible idea, using their, 100 years of experience.
Right.
And I listen. I like to listen a lot. But one of the things that I was pretty adamant about was we needed ports all over the still in key locations so that we could run in sensors, so that we could get data out of the still into databases and be able to control everything via Wi-Fi. Because at the time, I'd worked with some guys at some different distilleries, and it just blew me away on how crude their techniques were for running their stills. And it's like it hadn't changed in hundreds of years. One guy used, he kept a pair of binoculars around so that when he wanted to know what the still was doing, he'd grab the binoculars, walk to the other side of the distillery, and use the binoculars to look at a tiny temperature gauge at the very top of the still, 20 feet up. And so his measurement there is like plus or minus, 4 degrees or something like that. Whereas here, we've got sensors going into the still. That all that data gets logged. Our resolution on temperature is down to 0.03 degrees.
Wow.
And at that sort of resolution, we're able to do a little bit of physics and back out what the ABV is of the vapor inside of the still while we're distilling.
Wow.
And what I like to, talk about a lot is that when we're distilling, the alcohol comes over, and that's sort of the main product. But really, I kind of treat the alcohol kind of like pancakes, and we're really after the butter on the pancakes.
Okay.
And it's the aromatics that get carried over while we're distilling that we're really concerned about. And if you change, temperature by 1 degree, that's probably like a 3 points change in proof. And so your aromatics are going to be completely different at that point in time. And so if you're distilling a whiskey or a gin or a brandy or whatever you're distilling, to have that fore and the mid and the finish and have everything sort of come together at the end, you really need to know what you're pulling over. And we do everything by our palate. As we're distilling, we're tasting the whole way through, but we've got this level of control that allows us to really select out what we want that you just can't get with having some sort of crude measurement where you're looking through binoculars and maybe you'll walk around to the back side of the still and change a big old valve to change your how much steam you're pushing in, and you come back 20 minutes later and look at it again, and maybe you're like, oh, it needed a little bit more. Oops.
Right. What do you do?
But then you've collected 20 minutes worth of, off flavor. And so maybe you can correct it and mask it a little bit, or maybe you just need some better controls so that you don't make those mistakes.
Oh, it's very cool. And I've never heard those precise measurements that such a small degree difference can just totally blow off your aromatics and change, the whole result. I mean, tell me a bit about, so those controls, are you the first one doing this sort of thing? I mean, because I've never heard of anybody else doing these sorts of precise controls.
Yeah, I mean, when I was over at Vendome working with them on the still, and I brought up, when I asked for the ports, they said, well, what are you going to do with those? And I said, well, I'm going to run sensors in to be able to get data back and control and all that. And they were keenly interested. They'd never heard of anyone doing that before.
So you should get a copyright is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, right? I mean, yeah, it's funny because if you think about it, we could probably do something with that, but then we'd be in the tech industry. We'd be, trying to sell off, patented sort of technology. And, I prefer not to go down that route and love what we do and just keep it more of like a trade secret kind of thing, like how we actually build. It's also one of those things where it's hard to do. Like you need to fabricate your own electronics and controls, and you need the computer science side to be able to get that data in and be able and make it useful, and sort of a data scientist side to be able to analyze the data, extract out and massage it the way you need it to, and then the distiller and the palate side to be able to use the data to make a good spirit. And so it's a lot of skill sets under one roof, and I don't know if anybody else is doing it at this point in time. This is years later, but I think that as far as I'm concerned, I'm not really concerned about other people doing it, because I love what we do, and we are just going to continue doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you have your hands full. So I want to speak next about your sources, because I feel like that's another distinction that sort of separates you from a lot of other distilleries, is that you're sourcing as many things as you can locally. So tell me just a bit about that, your sources and kind of how you're going about that.
Yeah, absolutely. With grains, it's pretty easy. We've got, we're in California. In the Central Valley, they grow a lot of corn. Mm-hmm. And so just on the other side of San Francisco Bay, there's a town called Brentwood, and they grow a lot of corn there. It's kind of right behind sort of Oakland, Berkeley Hills. And that's where our corn comes from. It's all organic. It's these beautifully small, shriveled little kernels that kind of remind me of like a dry farm tomato, where it's not all puffed up and sort of blown out with sugar or starches. It's got a lot of flavor to it. And so, when we're distilling a whiskey that's using the corn, it's bringing through a lot of nuttiness and a lot of really good flavor. Locally, we are able to grow rye without any sort of irrigation. Corn would be different locally. And so we end up sourcing our rye locally we've got some friends on the other side of town, about 5 miles from here, that have, I think it's 150 acres. And so they do a cover crop of rye for us, and we get it from them when that comes ripe. For the rest of the year, there's a mill down the street that we get the rye from. And then for the barley, there's no barley that grows locally, so we get that from the Pacific Northwest. Mm-hmm. So up in Washington. And for other sort of products like our gin, we go as locally as possible, but it's one of those things where not all of the local botanicals are the best. And so when we were first developing our gin recipe, I think we took like 1.5 years, 2 years to actually produce, to whittle down which botanicals we want and what the sources were on them. As soon as we sort of whittled down to the botanicals and the flavor profile to get the balance that we wanted, we then came back and said, okay, well, let's source every single botanical individually from everywhere that we could, and then choose, like, say, our source on the juniper, or our source on the coriander, or the source on the lemons. And what we found was that the local juniper had this sort of resinous quality that was pretty astringent, and so we couldn't go with the local juniper. The juniper that we landed on was the Italian juniper. It's got this bright sort of citrus backbone. It's got a bunch of aromatics that just sort of come over, and it's just beautiful. And not all Italian junipers are the same. They're the same varietal, but we find from lot to lot and source to source that juniper is kind of similar to grapes in that you can have good growers and bad growers, and the people that treat the juniper well. And there's good vintages and bad vintages for juniper, and so we're really careful with our juniper selection. But also, in general, all of the botanicals that we sourced, we sort of did a blind study on them, just sort of distilling everything, tasting it, seeing how it integrated with the gin,
Right.
and just chose what we felt was best. And it turned out that everything that went into the gin ended up being either organic or wild harvested.
Oh, that's cool.
And it's just sort of a confirming thing of saying, oh yeah, you know, if you're not pushing your crops to do anything crazy, then you get the best flavor.
Yep.
And then our lemons, we use Meyer lemons off of our own Meyer lemon trees. We've got a little orchard. And so, you know, that the Meyer lemon that goes into it is bright and fresh and crisp. For other sourcing, like we have a coffee liqueur, and
Yeah,
that one is, oh yeah,
yeah.
thank you.
I got a picture. Here you go.
Yeah, our coffee liqueur is, we sourced coffee beans from a number of different roasteries, and we finally landed on Equator Coffees. And Equator does beautiful coffee beans. They're really good with their roasting. They're a great team to work with. We worked with them on developing this product. They're in some, you know, a lot of Michelin star restaurants for their, you know, after your dinner, you have your cup of coffee or whatever. And so they do a great job with their beans. They do a great job with the sourcing, like fair trade and all that sort of stuff. They're a B Corp, which is really nice. And so we landed on them, and we, you know, it's a fair trade mocha java. Those beans have some beautiful notes in them, some berry and dark chocolate notes, and we really think it shines inside of the spirit.
Well, for sure, and you could definitely taste that pure coffee flavor, that pure essence. It's really amazing stuff. And I know you blend this with your vodka that you're making as well.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's right. In the recipe development on that, we sort of we played around with things a lot, and you know, there's a lot of different coffee liqueurs out there that are pretty good. There's one that they sort of play off the Nola style. New Orleans, they do a coffee with chicory. There's a lot of other coffee liqueurs that are throwing in a bunch of caramel, that are throwing in a bunch of vanilla. But, you know, I'm sort of a big fan of dark coffee, of black coffee. And so when I started playing around with a bunch of different stuff, I found that it was really detracting from the coffee flavor.
Yeah.
And there's something really nice about showing off the beauty of the bean itself. And so, you know, really what we do is we just try to, in all of our products, we try to let the ingredients shine, present themselves in the cleanest possible sort of way.
Well, no, you're a purist, and you know it shows because you have that elegance, but also very straightforward, direct, pretty flavors. And I want to get back and just show the audience real quick. So you have your Scott Street gin, which I know is named after the street that the distillery is located on. So
Yeah.
I didn't know that for a long time, actually. So Scott Street gin, but then you also have a barrel aged, which is pretty cool too.
Yeah, absolutely. So our barrel aged is just our Scott Street gin. The cuts on it are slightly different, bringing out a little bit more higher aromatics. But then we take that and we push it into used Chardonnay barrels from one Sonoma winery and one Napa winery.
Cool.
And it's not like a big oaky, buttery Chardonnay. These are a crisper style of Chardonnay. And so, and that crispness really lends to the gin. There's a lot of barrel-aged gins out there where people take gin and they stick them in a used whiskey barrel.
Right.
And I kind of feel like, you know, they're doing a disservice to the gin itself. And one way that I could sort of point to that is that if you go out to any sort of mixology bar or anywhere, you never really find a cocktail where they throw whiskey and gin into the cocktail.
Yeah, true.
They just don't play well together. It's a poor pairing. And so, you know, back in the day when we were developing this, I'd never been a fan of barrel-aged gins, but I thought, okay, well, let's at least try something. We've got some used whiskey barrels around. Let's push them in there. And, I came back and kept on checking on it every month and a year later, and I hated it. And we actually still have those barrels.
Oh wow.
We have like some like 8-year-old barrel-aged gin sitting in barrels, which is kind of funny because I'd never wanted to release them, and I haven't figured out what to do with them. But at some point in time, I had this inspiration while drinking a nice Chardonnay that I was picking up these grassy notes and this lemon citrus and some stone fruit, and I thought this would pair beautifully within a gin, and we should grab some barrels from some of our friends and try it out. And we did, and what came across was just beautiful. You get these like green apple notes that come through, and the one thing that's tricky about barrel-aged gins in general are how you play with them in cocktails. I think our barrel-aged gin is really nice on its own, neat, or on the rocks. But if you're going to go after a cocktail with it, it's better if you think about it like a whiskey than a gin. And try it in any whiskey cocktail that you might make, like whether an old fashioned or a Manhattan or whatever have you.
Oh, interesting.
It's the barrel influence on the gin. It has some impact. You can see it's got a little bit of color there, and so you do get a little bit of softening from it. You get a little bit of vanilla notes coming from the barrel. You might get a little bit of toasty, maybe a little cederiness on it. It's all really light, but it's enough that if you try to just grab it and make a gin and tonic out of it, or a Negroni or something like that, it may not play exactly the way you'd want it to, like a gin. But if you go and you make an old fashioned out of it, and try to readjust your thinking on the old fashioned, and don't think it's going to be this rich, decadent cocktail. Instead, it's going to be a lighter, crisper, more nuanced cocktail. You're adding bitters and whatnot to your gin, and it just shines. It's just a beautiful thing.
I haven't done that with this one. I've just done it neat. So I'm gonna have to start playing with it with a whiskey frame of mind. So we're time slipping by as always, but so you started the distillery, and gin was your big focus in the beginning, but you also make some beautiful whiskey. So I want to get into that. So the Stony Point, I know, is kind of the flagship. Tell us a bit about that. And I know you're fermenting it in a unique way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we get in our grain from the farms, and then we mill it, we mash it. Mashing it's basically you're cooking the grain into a porridge. Mm-hmm. The enzymes that are inside of the malted barley convert all the starches that are tied up in all the grains into sugars, and that way you have something for the yeast to eat. Right. And when we ferment it, what we do is we push over every bit of it, the water, the grain, everything. And so it's called a grain-in mash. And the reason why we do that is because when you make a whiskey, you can't add flavors to it like a brewery would, like whipped hops or sugar or chamomile or whatever. Like, the definition of whiskey is that it's just grain and water and yeast, and that's it. And so we like to keep the grain in for as long as possible so that we can pull through as much flavor out of that grain as possible. So we also do an open top fermentation, and so what that means is that rather than doing like a clean, sterile fermentation that like a brewery might do, instead we're inviting in the local terroir to sort of create its own sort of twist on the alcohol production. And what we see is we do pitch a yeast in the very beginning, and this is kind of opposite of what some winemakers do. Some winemakers, they'll crush the grapes, they'll let a wild fermentation take off, and then they'll pitch yeast to produce the alcohol they want and let it finish out properly. We do the opposite sort of approach. What we do is we pitch our yeast in the beginning, and then the alcohol gets produced, and then at the end of that, the wild stuff takes over. And the alcohol production takes place over the course of like 4 or 5 days, and then it takes 2 or 3 more days for that wild fermentation to really take off and have a big impact. And that whole process, we're tasting it and measuring it. And then once it's finished up, we push it all into the still and distill it into our whiskey.
It's such a cool process. I've never heard of anybody doing open top ferments prior to the distillation. That's really cool, and I'm sure it adds to the complexity. You know, wild yeast is always celebrated in the wine world, and it makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't it work in whiskey?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. It adds a lot to the complexity, like the flavor generation, and then also the mouthfeel. But then also just, looking at our Stony Point there, another interesting point on our whiskeys is that they are aged in both American and French barrels for the Stony Point. We choose both styles of wood because the French adds this nice balanced elegance to it that kind of lifts some higher aromatics. But then the American whiskey or the American wood pulls through this body and with a big punch, like you might find some like bigger Napa cabs that use some American oak. And we do a blend between the different barrels when we're going to bottle up. Mm-hmm. And it's something that's the other thing that's a big differentiating factor is that we don't use the standard whiskey barrels at all. We're generally using Bordeaux style barrels, and they're all coopered here locally in Napa. We work with the cooperage here, and they're all seasoned oak. Most whiskeys out on the market, they use unseasoned oak. They're all kiln dried. And I don't know if you guys have ever had Retsina, like that Greek wine.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of whiskeys that are on the market that have this distinct resinous quality to them. And I think and it's that burned sap that's in there from the kiln made. And so, our whiskey generally doesn't have that because they're all seasoned. And you also get some other effects like some, the lactones shift and whatnot from the seasoning of the oak. But it makes it a much more balanced pour that isn't overpowered with this resinous quality. Yeah. And so in some ways it comes across a little bit more like a brandy in some ways. Our barrels are still charred in addition to the toast. And that's something that's beautiful about working with the local cooperage that's used to making wine barrels is that they can do whatever we want them to do. Cool. And they do that multiple stage where they're putting in toasts and chars, and we're really able to tweak and tune these barrels in a way that you can't with, a cooperage out of Kentucky or Missouri is where they usually come from. And so it's, those guys are kiln drying and charring them, and then they go out the door, and that's it.
No, and people don't realize how complicated the world of barrel making is, and the level of granular specifics that you can, 16 different levels of toast, all these different things. So it's cool. You have a local source that you can work with and play with things and get things on the fly, which is, you're really in a sweet spot there, which, we mentioned you're up there in Petaluma, which, it's a unique thing. I mean, you wouldn't think of having a distillery initially in wine country, but it's really helped, the evolution of everything you've done, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel, really lucky that we landed here because I'm originally from Southern California. We lived in New York for a while. When we came back, we had some family in the area here, and so that's why we landed here. And just, that was just sheer luck that we're just embedded in the wine country here. And there's just so much resources here to pull off of and to learn from and to sort of fine tune our own sort of style and techniques that we do.
And speaking of techniques, we have to talk about the stout barrel. Walk us through this quickly as well, because this is a very unique process. I've never heard of anybody making a stout exactly like this. So give us the rundown on the stout.
Yeah, absolutely. So, being here in Petaluma, there's a lot of breweries around us, up and down the Highway 101 here. And one thing that we're lucky to have is a neighbor that did a barrel-aged stout that didn't finish out the way that they wanted it to. And so they gave us all these barrels of stout. We distilled it. and then we drank it all. And at the end of the last barrel there, we were thinking, oh, we gotta put this into production. And so we started brewing our own stout beer and distilling it.
Wow. Okay.
And this is a chocolate coffee stout that we brew. And it doesn't mean that we put chocolate and coffee into it. Instead, it's the toasting of the malts in the same way that you toast a barrel to evoke vanilla or caramel or baking spices and things like that. When you toast these malts, you can get like sort of chocolate and espresso and those sort of characters out of it. And so when we distill this, you know, anytime you distill something, it comes over, you know, crystal clear, gin clear. And out of the still, this spirit has these really bright espresso notes and dark chocolate notes.
That's cool.
The tannins on that are pretty big. And so we push that straight into only American oak barrels. Again, those are Bordeaux style, American oak. And we do that because, you know, the big American oak sort of is able to stand up against the stout qualities.
Right.
But then once that's finished up aging, we then push that into used bourbon barrels that Lagunitas Brewery has used to age their stout beer in. And it's sort of a similar sort of approach that we do with the Chardonnay barrels and the gin. Our whiskey is then able to integrate with the stout that's been absorbed into the oak on those barrels. And it lends it this sort of rich, decadent sort of quality to it, where if you're sipping it neat, it's a beautiful spirit with a lot of depth, you know, paired well with cigars and all that sort of stuff. And then if you're making a cocktail out of it, it just makes this super rich, decadent cocktail that's, and when I say rich and all that, I don't mean it's got sweet qualities or anything like that. It's got this depth and decadence to it that really sort of brings to life a lot of cocktails.
You know, it's the depth and the complexity on the stout is amazing. And I think it's so cool that you start, so you're not only making a whiskey, but you're also making a beer first. So first of all, you have to make a good beer, then distill it, and then age it, and then it goes back into barrels that had aged stout previously. So it's like start to finish. You know, you have stout on both ends. So
yeah, full circle.
Yeah, it's so cool. So we're running out of time, but I wanted to see if you could just quickly walk us around, you know, the distillery just for a quick second and just show us, since we have a live feed, we might as well. Give us a quick tour of the facility, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll try to keep the camera. So this is our main production floor here. We have, you know, the still here, Betty.
Betty, yeah.
Yeah. And then we've got some receiving tanks that we distill into. Behind me here, we've got some large fermenters. Mm-hmm. Those are some 90 barrels. We've got a number of tanks over here. We've got, you know, some open top horizontal fermenters that provide a different sort of quality of the fermentation in terms of yeast health and whatnot. We've got a mash kettle back there. I should probably not hang out in here too long. I just realized I'm not wearing my mask and my crew's out here.
We don't want you to get in trouble.
Yeah. And then this way, you know, we've got a little tasting room here that you can see our sort of swag and spirits and stuff like that. And then this is just sort of the quick and dirty tour, but sort of coming through here, this is sort of one of our sellers, hashtag slash some storage right now. And we all also use this room as some event space too. But you can see here, you know, this isn't your typical whiskey cellar. You know, these barrels are actually beautiful. You know, they look more like a winery cellar's barrels. We're also doing some fun projects with puncheons. So we've got some really big 500-liter stuff going on. We've got some hogsheads around. But yeah, playing around with barrels is a lot of fun. It's a joy to go through the cellar and taste what's happening over the years.
Yeah, exactly. And then, another thing that doesn't get people don't talk about a lot is then you're taking all these barrels and then blending them together and then trying to come up with a final product, which is, even as complicated, if not even more so than all the rest of the processes that you went through. And then, you don't want to mess it up at the last stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the aging process is also, incredibly difficult because you're dealing with oak and, is the wood grown on the south side of the hill or the north side of the hill, and the different qualities that the oak is lending to the spirit. We have every time we're barreling down, it's like an experiment in itself.
Yeah.
Whether we're choosing different toasts and chars for barrels, or even just a set of barrels that should be exactly the same, but then you taste them 4 years later and they've got such different qualities going on with them.
Yeah.
Also like a baker, depending on where you stick the barrels in your cellar, you're going to get different qualities out of the barrels themselves. Like, is it on a warmer side? Is it higher up? Is it lower down? And all that affects the aging process. And unfortunately, it's not a really quick experiment. It takes 4 years or more to really age out our whiskeys. So,
Right. And then figure out if it worked or not after spending all that time and money and effort and 4 years later, and then see what happened. It's a crazy experiment. You're a bit of a masochist, but we love you for it.
well, I'm glad somebody likes that. So thank you.
All right. Well, we're over in time, but Mike, I want to just thank you again for all your time and the quick tour, and keep up the great work. You're making amazing spirits, and it's just such a pleasure to represent them on the East Coast. And we really love having you as part of the team. So it's been a great new addition for us.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
So maybe we'll get back to you again in the future. But for today, we'll sign off. For those who are still with us, thank you so much for joining us. Our next live will be in 2 weeks, January 28th, and we'll be going live from Spain with Alvaro Palacios, cult winemaker and one of the most respected, highly regarded winemakers in Spain, in Priorat. So again, Mike, thank you so much. Tell your wife, Jenny, thank you for all her help as well behind the scenes. She was helping coordinate this. But we'll sign off for now, and thank you again.
Great. Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a great rest of the day.